up, we have Jeff Harry, who is the positive psychology play speaker. Jeff combines positive psychology and play to help organizations create psychologically safe workplaces through embracing a play-oriented approach. Jeff was selected by Bamboo HR as Engagedly as a top 100 HR influencer, and has been featured in the New York Times, Mashable, Shondaland, and Wired. So welcome, Mr. Harry. He's going to be joining conversation with our own amazing Hunter Canning, who is a virtual event host with Power to Fly. Hunter is a New York-based actor, puppeteer, producer, and photographer. As a conscious citizen of the world, his ethos is bringing people together through all facets of life, be it producing live performance downtown, creating corporate recruitment content, or photographing portraiture, red carpets, and live events. Hunter has a passion for bringing people together to foster growth, kindness, and a true understanding of each other. I'm really excited to hear this conversation, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, Meg. So good to hear you and see you. And Jeff, dude, do better. Let's talk about it.
Let's get into it. I'm excited.
Okay, my friend. So tell me, let's just jump right in tell me a little bit about your personal story. Tell me about that bow tie you're wearing. I think they're a little interconnected there.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Where'd you come from?
Lego bow tie I'm wearing. I'll tell you my Batman origin story in a really quick way. So I don't know if you ever saw the movie Big as a kid with Tom Hanks, but he basically gets to play with toys for a living. And as soon as I saw that movie, I started writing toy companies in third grade. And I just didn't stop writing them until I got into the toy industry. And the way that actually ties in with this talk is I finally arrived into these companies and I found them to be so toxic. There was so much toxic masculinity, but I didn't have the words at the time to express it. But there was no fun, no joy, no high fives, no collaboration. Everyone was out for themselves. And it really destroyed my belief in the dream job. And I had my quarter life crisis, and I remember leaving New York, coming to the Bay Area, and then bumping into an organization that was teaching kids engineering with Lego. There were 7 of us at the time. And we grew it into the largest Lego inspired STEM organization in the US. But we did it using, which my friend Angie actually pointed out to me, using a lot of feminine leadership traits. We followed our curiosity, we followed our intuition, we were much more collaborative, we were much more empathetic when it came to our staff. And frankly, we had no business plan. We were much more process oriented than results oriented. And that made us really successful. So when we got so large and we started teaching 100,000 kids a year, Silicon Valley started to pay attention to us, like Facebook, Google, Adobe, and they were like, hey, do you want to do team building events for us? And we're like, yeah, of course we do. We do them all the time, even though we didn't. We just said yes to everything. And we ended up, I ended up running for a decade team building events for the top tech companies in the world. But I found, again, that same toxic masculinity showing up, preventing them from doing their best work and creating a psychologically safe workspace. So that's why I created Rediscover Your Play, to start to address this stuff through positive psychology and play.
Yeah. So you mentioned, and this is the topic, right? Toxic masculinity. Can you define that? I think we hear that word a lot. It's kicked around. I feel like it can be very specific and it can also be very vague at times. And so can you talk maybe about what the consequences are in the workplace as well?
Yeah, so, there's a lot of different definitions for it. The definition I like the most is toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood. And then it's defined by violence and sex and status and aggression, right? So a lot of the traits you see in toxic masculine leadership is bullying, avoiding losing at all costs. We got to win no matter what, restraining one's emotions, showing strength through aggression. And the results of that is lack of psychological safety, huge amounts of turnover in many ways. And we'll get into this, but I really felt like it drove the Great Resignation, and it creates this really unsafe space where it feels like a boys' club. It feels like a fraternity. And even now you would think, 20 years ago, Silicon Valley had just started. We're having the same issues that we were having back in 2000 because we're not willing to address this issue.
Well, yeah, let's get right into the Great Resignation. You mentioned that. Do you want to talk about that connection there?
Yeah. So, a lot of people are like, oh, what do you mean toxic masculinity drove the Great Resignation? Well, think about it. All right. The most toxic masculine traits that you saw during that time was a lot of bullying, staff trying to be forced to get back to work before there was a vaccine, lack of transparency, a lot of secrecy. So if people were getting furloughed or they were getting laid off or they were just like in limbo during that time, a lot of their leaders were not telling them what to do. And then it was like a free-for-all. It was almost like every person for themselves, because even when some companies got PPP money, they found that some companies use that money to reward executives, to buy back stocks so they could increase, the value of the stock for their shareholders, but it would be at the expense of their staff. So they were, prioritizing profit over their employees. And that after doing that throughout 2000, and so much trust was lost, in 2021, 47.4 million people voluntarily quit their job, didn't get laid off, voluntarily quit their job. And when they were asked why, they communicated they felt devalued, exploited, used, and underpaid for their work. So if we're really going to address this Great Resignation and not have it remain just consistent the way we're like not dealing with COVID, then we're going to be in the same situation a year from now. It's just going to be with new organizations.
So you mentioned talking about the Great Resignation was driven by and influenced by this toxic masculinity. So that's something that costs the companies. But what else is toxic masculinity costing companies that are like infected with this?
It's costing them money. Frankly, at the end of the day, if company's goal is to make more money, when you are not bringing a diverse amount of leadership, they found that many female VC firms are actually more successful than male VC firms, simply because it's a much more collaborative, curious environment. When you are driving a lot of your work through fear, productivity levels have been measured to go down by 40%. So people are less likely to share during meetings. They're less likely to actually take risks and be innovative. And a lot of times, especially, when it comes to like a toxic culture, I say this a lot, culture is defined by the worst behavior tolerated. So if you are tolerating someone that emanates toxic masculinity, and mind you, this doesn't have to be a man. This could be a man, this could be a woman, this could be someone that identifies as trans, that communicating those traits and attributes creates such an unsafe space that you're like, you're rewarding that guy, so then why do I want to work so hard if you're rewarding that level of behavior?
So what type of behavior do we want to reward and not this bad behavior that seems to continually get rewarded?
So, I've been talking about this more and more, but it's just, we have to be looking at what actually is working, who is focused on bringing shared humanity, empathy, compassion, a certain level of humility. You see certain, I try to think of the leaders that I really respect, right? There was Jacinda Ardern, who was the prime minister of New Zealand. They had the lowest COVID rates out of all the countries around the world, right? And what did she do? She found a balance between both masculine and feminine leadership. At the same time that she was firm and very clear, she was also very compassionate and collaborative, and worked with her citizens to be like, listen, we're going to lock down, and we're going to be very serious about this lockdown, and then we're going to be able to get out of it. And they were the quickest ones to get out of it, right? You can even currently, address what's happening with the Ukraine-Russian crisis, where Zelensky is showing a certain level of compassion and empathy and care and willingness to be in the trenches next to his troops and next to his citizens, while you have the flip side of Putin, who can't even sit close to his staff because he doesn't trust them, right? Like, you just see it blatantly over and over again, and you see us having to actually suffer from it. And I referenced this one story a friend of mine shared with me, where she is currently at an organization where they're dealing with someone that recently was accused of sexual harassment, along with other toxic, just exhibiting a lot of toxic masculine traits. And they were having a meeting trying to figure out how they can talk to this person in a way to not make that person feel uncomfortable. So the whole organization, the whole team is adapting to this toxic person, which is causing them even more strain and stress and time and money because, and it's like, why are we adapting to this one person? This makes no sense. Why are we not instead creating a more safe space that rewards a majority of people instead of rewarding bad behavior?
Yeah, and on that note, we just got a comment from someone in the audience, and feel free if you have any questions in the audience, please do drop it in the chat, and we would love to answer them. Allison writes, I quit a job within a year of being hired because a male VP would scream at reps of companies we were partnered with. I brought it up to the owner, and the response was, well, that's just the way he is.
Yes. And why do we tolerate that? We always say that, well, that's just how he is, right? So what I do, and we'll get to more of the solutions, but what I would do in a situation like that, right, is be like, okay, I've heard arguments, and I apologize, I'm going to use the word Chad. If there's a Chad in the audience, I'm sorry. But like, say, for example, you have a Chad. Let's say you have someone that is toxic, but brings in a lot of revenue, right? So because this is what a lot of leaders are like, well, Chad's bringing in a ton of revenue. So like, we can't let go of Chad. Chad brought in $500,000 in revenue last year, right? So you go straight at that and you're like, okay, yes, that is completely valid. Also, Chad got Allison as well as 2 other people to quit during that time. And even though they weren't bringing in as much revenue, they were only bringing in around 250 each, that adds up to $750,000 that we lost, right? Then you have to take in consideration all the training and the hiring costs. So we're talking about $20,000 to $30,000 just to hire new staff. And who knows how long it's going to take to get that. And then in addition to that, if you have someone acting like this, eventually they're probably going to cause a sexual harassment lawsuit, which average amount just for a company to address these lawsuits is $250,000. And then if they lose, the average is around $570,000. So when you go up to your boss and you're like, well, that's just the way he is. Well, you do know that even though Chad brought in $500,000, he lost us $330,000 last year and might even cost us even more, up to $1 million. So when you flip it that way, those are some of the ways you can start to argue, why are we doing this? Because it's actually affecting the bottom line. It's affecting your pocket as well as mine.
Yeah. Well, let's back up and pause for a second. So, and we have more questions coming in from the audience. This is great. We're gonna keep jumping in. So why are you talking about toxic masculinity as a man? Tomorrow, International Women's Day. Here's 2 dudes talking about toxic masculinity. Why are you talking about it? Why should anyone listen to you or me?
I mean, that's a valid concern because there's probably much more feminist leaders that can speak to this in a really important way. The reason why I'm speaking about it is like, it shouldn't be a woman's problem. This is not their problem. It's our problem. We're the ones that are causing this problem. And we have chosen not to address this. So if anything, there needs to be more male allyship. And frankly, there just needs to be more men speaking up because it's not only affecting women, it's affecting us. It's affecting our organization. It's affecting how we show up. Because when you have a man that dominates a certain meeting or conversation, it affects all of the other men that are like, oh, is that the behavior I should be emulating? Is that how I should be acting? And many men know that they don't want to act that way. They don't want to. And it's usually, if you see bro culture is usually driven just by a few dudes, just a few toxic guys, right? Or sometimes a woman that is emulating toxic masculinity because that is what's being rewarded. So more men need to be speaking up. And that's part of the reason why I'm starting to get into this and diving into this more and more, because I'm not seeing enough men speaking about this issue wholeheartedly and trying to lift the veil finally off of it.
Yeah. So you're being an active force of, you're hoping and you're working to be an active force of change in what you're doing. And so how can we continue to solve this problem from a variety of levels, and similarly, from our audience here, Liana, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. How should you bring up a toxic masculine work culture to your boss who thrives in it? So like, here we are talking about, here's a scenario of like, they have the power. I'm, you know, they're my boss. How do I bring this up with them or bring it up at HR? Do I escalate it? Am I going to get fired for doing this? You know, there's all of these panics that I imagine can start to unfold.
Yeah. So, you know, when I'm giving advice, a lot of times, first, I'm like, you do have to make sure that you have the safety and the grounds to actually speak on this, right? Because I don't ever want to suggest someone to, and they're like, I don't feel safe to talk about this. Then this might not be the right time to actually talk about it, right? But my recommendation when I'm speaking to a lot of staff about this is you have more leverage than you ever had in the history of work. And I need to repeat the fact that you have more leverage because there's so many more job openings. You should understand your value outside of your organization so that you have other options if you're willing to dive into this, because this is a lot of work. You have to decide, do I even want to bring this up? Do I even want to be, you know, one of the people that stands up to this, almost like the union rep and being like, I'm going to speak upon this, because it's a lot. You have to decide, you know, am I invested in it? And if you are invested in this organization, that's when you have to start compiling and running the numbers. What has toxic masculinity currently caused? What has certain people's leadership actually caused? What happened during the pandemic, and what happened during this great resignation that we really haven't addressed in our organization? Because frankly, if we don't address this toxic masculinity, what's going to happen is new people will come to the company and they'll leave within a month or 2 months. So when you're bringing it up using those certain levels of metrics and being like, this is what it's currently costing us, your leaders are more likely to hear you. It's not guaranteed they will, but at least you now have numbers to back it, besides the fact of like, I just want to address the toxic masculinity that's here, or I just want to address the bro culture. Actually, I just want to address how Chad's behavior is impacting our work. That's how I would speak about it, you know. And when Chad acts in that way, he gets, you know, Brogan over here to also act in that way. And then all of a sudden it becomes a frat house. And frankly, I don't think we do our best work when we're a frat house. When you're presenting it like that to your boss, at least then, or to HR, at least then they could be like, okay, let me think about this. Now, if they are like, I don't really care, whatever, we're going to do it this way, that at least then tells you, this is not the right organization for you anymore. At least you have now stated what your boundaries are and what issues you have, and then it's on them to try to change it. Now, that's from like the entry level and like staff. From a mid-level manager situation, if you're a mid-level manager, right now you should be asking your staff, both women and men and trans, whoever is there, you know, did we build trust or did we lose trust during this pandemic? And you should be starting to ask questions around psychological safety. Do you feel comfortable talking up, you know, when we're at a meeting? Who currently do you feel is actually taking away from our meetings? You know, what do you recognize a certain level of toxicity that I really haven't started to address? Because those mid-level managers, they might not be able to change the entire culture of the organization, but they can alter the team. They can check that Chad, that, you know, that toxic person, and start to create a safer space for people to speak up. One other thing you can actually do from, you know, either the mid-level or the entry-level position is start taking up more space at meetings. So if you do have a toxic masculine person that is constantly taking up all the space at meetings, you organize before the meeting and you're like, look, you know, Samantha, look, you know, Jennifer, look, Jeff, when Chad cuts you off, I'm going to speak up for you and make sure that you actually get to say what you have to say. But then I need you to do the same. And we need to do this over the next 3 to 6 months as we slowly start to reoccupy this meeting and take it back for a majority of the people and create a more safer meeting. These are some of the small ways that we can address it. And I can get into what executive leadership can do in a moment.
Well, there's so much in there. And you mentioned earlier bro culture as well. And we had a comment from Daniel that said, very curious how to rework a bro culture in some offices where there isn't a ton that would be against a code of conduct as written, but it's very welcoming to women and people of color by default.
So what's the question?
I don't know if that's a question. They might just be commenting on what we're talking about here with the bro culture, and I think it's a really valid point to that we're stuck in these dynamics, and I really enjoy what you're saying about this united front in the meeting. I think that's really interesting, because what I'm hearing in that that hypothetical is there's people that are in the same boat, and then there's also allyship helping.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
There were men in that scenario that are helping.
Yes.
Or people that just are feel welcome taking up more space. So they're helping other people take up
space. Or there's male allies that are like, listen, I know I'm not going to get fired, or I'm not going to get in trouble to speak up. So I can take some of your concerns and bring them up to leadership for us, if that is what you want to do, or we can do it as a united front. But I think, and let's tie back into the bro culture of like, why are we rewarding bro culture, right? Like Uber was bro culture. That's why it was a toxic environment and is not doing as well. WeWork was a bro culture. Wolf of Wall Street. We continue to celebrate these toxic masculine leaders, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, like, and a lot of these times, these organizations are not healthy organizations that continue to exist. Some are able to get by, like Bezos, but others just crumble before you. And we've seen enough of these storylines that we realize this is not helpful as we move into a future of work where, frankly, empathy, shared compassion, and shared, humanity are the wave of the future if you want to be successful. Because a lot of Gen Z, and heck, even millennials and Gen Xers, are done. They're just done with that like old boys club, Mad Men, world that we used to live in coming out of this pandemic. A lot of people almost died during this pandemic or saw their loved ones die. And they're like, I don't want to devote 2,500 hours a year to something that contributes to toxic masculinity. I'm just done with that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned we talked about lower level, mid-level. What can executives do? People at the top, how can they make a change in their company?
So I think there's two really important things. First, they need to start funding employee resource groups, ERGs. There's a lot of these employee resource groups that pop up, ones that are specifically built around diversity or built, around like addressing toxic masculinity, and they get no money. Yet like there's money for like team building, and there's money for, like company parties and all this stuff. So start funding these organizations, because these ERGs are what actually helps retain employees. It's sometimes the only safe space for people to express themselves outside of their team. Then on top of that, they need to be asking themselves, leaders need to be asking themselves, what behavior has been rewarded so far? Who are the type of people that are being rewarded? What are my teams and executive leaderships looking like? Is it looking like a bunch of Chads? Is it looking like, there was one organization in Finland I was reading about where they had 26 of the same person named Milos. Is the same guy. They just kept promoting the same guy. Why do we have, these boards that don't represent what the community looks like? And then also recognize that we need to be changing our metrics. The metrics need to not be so short-sighted. Oh, let's reward based off of like just quarterly earnings. You should be rewarding on who has the highest retention, who has higher job satisfaction, which leaders are actually helping with well-being and really focused on the mental health of their staff. We need to be changing the metrics that we've been measuring, because right now the metrics that we measure are solely based off of like a slave mentality of how much can one produce, and I don't really care how we produce it and how much we need to exploit to produce it. That's just not built off of humanity, and that's not the future of work.
I love that you're talking about the metrics, I think is really important. So you gave some examples, but can you elaborate a bit more on like, how do you measure it? Like, how do you measure it? How do you know?
So I mean, the way in which I've noticed, or the best ways in which I've measured, quality. Let's give an example with Dan Price with gravity payments, right? This is a guy that was laughed at back in 2015 for giving $70,000 as a minimum salary, right? Later on, what happened? During the pandemic, they laid off nobody. Everyone was willing to take a pay cut because they realized what Dan, as well as the leadership team, hey, they had gotten our back in 2015, 2016. Now we're going to get the back of each other. It was more of a collective community. It was focused on building community and building trust and being transparent and being vulnerable, right? So when you're seeing that, when you're seeing leadership actually be vulnerable, when you're seeing leadership actually be like, we're experimenting, we're trying something new out, and I don't know how this is going to work, instead of using aggression, those are some of the ways in which you can start to see like, oh, this is the new way in which we should be leading. And really, retention is a huge metric that I don't think we look at enough. And I think mid-level managers as well as leaders need to be looking back at the exit interviews of all those people that quit and look at what patterns actually existed. Heck, if you can call some of those people that actually left, if you can, and pay them to tell you how bad your organization is, because you need to start to lift the veil on all of the mistakes you made during the pandemic and pre-pandemic. And if you're not willing to address those, your company is going to be obsolete. I'm not going to say they're going to be gone, but they're going to be like Blockbuster or Sears. They're going to be not as relevant because you're not adapting to the future, which is built off of bringing community and shared empathy back to work.
Yes, absolutely. So we have just a couple minutes left. Before we wrap up, would you say, is there any advice you could give to, maybe let's talk about like each area of the workforce, right? If you're like starting out, if you're mid-level, if you're executive, we kind of hammer out some advice to each team.
So if you're just starting out, or you're early on, I would recommend that you start looking for allies. You start building a community of allies, and then you start gathering data. It's all about gathering data and trying to start to make the case as to what is a better version. And heck, you can even experiment and say, hey, our team is going to lead in this way, and then the other teams just go whatever you've been doing before. Let's see who actually wins. Let's see who actually makes more money when we're much more collaborative, much more experimental, and much more, humanity focused, right? So that's what one can do at the lower level. And also remember that you have more leverage than you've ever had. At the mid-level, you should be looking at exit interviews and understand, and also talking to your staff about what mistakes have we made, and, how have we rewarded toxic masculinity in the past, and how we can change it. Many of the answers lie with your staff. They have the best suggestions. We need to start spending much more time listening and less time trying to defend this type of behavior. And then, at the executive and leadership level, you need to start changing your metrics. You need to start addressing, much more feminine leadership metrics that actually build a much more collaborative, community-oriented company that is driven by looking out for one another. That's how you build retention. That's how you build loyalty again. And if you don't do that, then you're going to constantly have that revolving door of turnover. That's just the reality, And then we, as a society, if we're going to go that big, we need to stop rewarding toxic masculinity. Right now, there's like 4 movies coming out. One about Elizabeth Holmes, very toxic, the WeWork guy, the Uber guy, and then also, Wolf of Wall Street is now considered a great movie for financiers. We need to stop celebrating this toxic masculine leadership model that clearly doesn't work and clearly detrimentally affects the workforce.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff. We are out of time. I see your handle is displayed on your screen there. Where can people connect? Is it LinkedIn? What's the best way to stay in touch?
So the best way they can connect with me is at Jeff Harry Plays, JeffHarryPlays, and I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, all those. And you can also hit me up at rediscoveryourplay.com. And let's start to dismantle toxic masculinity in the workforce, especially dudes. We got to do better.
Let's do better, dudes. Thank you, Jeff.